The moment the chief technology officer asked how many stock options I held, I knew exactly how this corporate game would end. I just did not realize how satisfying it would be. We were sitting in an overpriced mountain lodge in Colorado, pretending to be visionary leaders while sipping cucumber water like it was rocket fuel. It was one of those retreats where everyone wears fleece vests and talks about changing the world while neglecting the basic infrastructure holding the company together. One by one, the chief technology officer, Logan Pierce, went down the row. He was asking each department head how many shares they had, like a rancher checking cattle tags before the autumn slaughter. Logan was 34, smug, and wore $1,200 designer sneakers that looked like they had been dipped in plastic. He loved to talk about skin in the game and ownership, but his hands had never been dirty with real database, recovery, or server maintenance. When the questioning finally got to me, I did not flinch. I sat there, 54 years old, with 30 years of engineering experience under my belt, and looked him straight in the eyes. "None," I said. "I never asked for any. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood floor." It was like I had just confessed to a crime on the cheese board. Logan cocked his head, like he had just found a beetle in his salad. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "No equity," he said, then turned his shoulder to the board chairman, treating me as if I had suddenly vanished from the room. "Dead weight," Logan muttered. He did not even try to whisper. He called me dead weight. The man who single-handedly built the database synchronization modules they bragged about on stage. The engineer whose network architecture saved our primary client database from a massive breach just last winter. But sure, let us pretend the guy without shares is just taking up oxygen. I watched the faces around the table shift. I could feel the change. It was like someone had cracked a window open in a blizzard. Sudden, invisible, but unmistakably freezing. Nobody defended me. Not our head of operations, not the general counsel, and not even the chief financial officer who had once called me the engine under the hood during our Series A funding round. They all suddenly found their sparkling water and mini blueberry muffins incredibly fascinating, looking down like toddlers caught watching a dog make a mess. Nobody wanted to cross the rising star of the C-suite, so I just smiled, very faintly. It was the kind of smile that says, "You have absolutely no idea what you just stepped in, but you are going to find out soon enough." After that meeting, nobody said a word to me. There were no congratulations on the 6-year infrastructure map I had just presented, even though it made our competitor's setup look like a cheap dial-up router. Logan stayed behind with the board members, and as I walked down the hall, I could hear muffled laughter through the double-pane glass doors. I did not need translation. I went back to my rental room, packed my bags, and poured myself a cup of stale hotel coffee. It tasted like burnt disappointment and cheap vanity. But the thing is, when you know you are being pushed out in real time, you do not sit around waiting for a severance package. You start looking at the foundation. That night, lying in the hotel bed, I did not think about stock options. I thought about patents, specifically the 17 patents I had quietly written, submitted, and secured years ago under the name of a small Delaware limited liability company called Vance Tech IP Holdings. I had set up that entity back when I was still working as an independent contractor, long before Valerix hired me full-time. In those days, the company was scrambling for survival, and nobody paid attention to where the real code came from, as long as it kept the platform from crashing. When they finally offered me a permanent role in 2019, they forgot the most basic rule of tech hiring. They never asked me to sign an intellectual property assignment agreement for my existing database modules. It was a rookie mistake, the kind of oversight that eventually costs a company its entire valuation. But everyone was too busy posing for trade magazine features and posting empty platitudes about teamwork on LinkedIn to read the legal paperwork. I actually did ask once, you know. I asked Dennis Miller, my old boss, about formalizing my equity ownership over the core modules I created. Dennis just smiled, patted me on the shoulder, and told me it was not the right time, promising I would be taken care of once we hit our next growth milestone. Then Dennis left for a venture capital firm, and I got reassigned to a small desk next to the copy machine. So I never asked again. When people keep shifting the goalposts, the only logical move is to stop playing their game. But while they were busy measuring success in restricted stock units and marketing buzzwords, I was keeping the receipts. They were about to learn that when you call the chief architect dead weight, you should probably make sure you actually own the blueprints to the house first. 3 days after the Colorado retreat, the corporate axe finally fell. The email arrived in my inbox at 9 o'clock in the morning. The subject line read, "Team realignment, please meet with human resources." It was written exactly like that, with a lowercase header, as if trying to make a termination sound like a gentle yoga transition. I did not bother replying. You do not get invited to a morning meeting with human resources and a new calendar invite, unless the decision has already been made and the security access is about to be cut. I showed up exactly on time. I wore my usual flannel shirt, jeans, and work boots. No excuses, no desperation, just absolute calm. The kind of quiet confidence that makes corporate executioners feel deeply uncomfortable. They sat me in the small conference room on the 4th floor, the one with the fake plastic tree and the chairs designed to discourage anyone from staying too long. Across from me sat Brenda Clark, the human resources director. She was clutching a plastic clipboard like it was a shield against the legal shrapnel she was about to release. Next to her sat a tall man in a dark suit I had never seen before. He did not introduce himself, but his presence was obvious. Security. He just hovered by the door like a silent shadow. Brenda started with the usual corporate pleasantries, which only made the situation more pathetic. "George, thank you so much for coming in on such short notice," she began, adjusting her glasses. "First, we really want to recognize your incredible contributions to Valerix over the years." I raised my hand slightly to cut her off. "Save the speech, Brenda," I said. "Let us just get to the part where I hand over my badge and get walked out of the building." She blinked, startled by the directness, then quickly jumped to the pre-written script on her clipboard. "Due to recent market shifts and strategic restructuring, we have made the difficult decision to sunset several legacy engineering roles," she said, using the word sunset as if I were a retired screensaver. She slid a thick folder across the mahogany table. Inside was the standard termination agreement, effective immediately, termination without cause. A reminder of my non-compete clause, which was legally toothless in our state anyway, and a demand for the immediate return of all company assets. No severance pay, no extended benefits, just a bulleted list of logistics. I read through the document once, checked for any hidden clauses, and then slid it back. "Okay," I said. Brenda looked confused. "Okay," she repeated. "Yes, okay," I replied, standing up. "I will grab my jacket." The security guard walked half a step behind me as I made my final pass through the office. I had literally designed the layout of this engineering floor. I had fought the facilities team to keep the quiet rooms, and I had personally specified the ventilation system for the server room down the hall. Every doorway we passed carried my fingerprints, yet not a single person looked up. The junior developers I had mentored for 3 years kept their eyes glued to their monitors. The database administrator, whose career I had saved during the system crash last summer, suddenly found his code review very urgent. They all wore their noise-canceling headphones, maintaining a collective silence that felt louder than any shouting. At my desk, I packed my life into a cardboard box, my old coffee mug with the faded logo, a few handwritten notebooks, and a flash drive containing nothing but my personal configuration files. My access card beeped one last time at the turnstile, and the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind me. There was no farewell email, no goodbye lunch, and no digital footprints left of George Vance on the company channels. By noon, my account was deactivated, and I was officially gone. I walked out into the crisp autumn air. The wind blew dry leaves across the concrete pavement, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. For 6 years, I had arrived at that office before sunrise, sacrificing my weekends and my personal life to build their platform, only to be thrown away like an obsolete server module. I walked to a nearby diner, ordered a plate of eggs and black coffee, and stared out the window. There was no panic, no regret. I knew the math was on my side. The very next morning, I rented a quiet corner desk at a small co-working space 3 blocks from my apartment. It did not have cold brew on tap or neon signs telling me to hustle. It just had concrete walls, strong coffee, and the quiet silence of people actually working. I opened my personal laptop, booted up the system, and clicked on a folder labeled Advanced Tech IP Holdings. Inside were the 17 registered patents. These were not generic concepts. They were highly specific compression protocols, signal routing algorithms, and memory management structures. I logged into the Delaware Business Registry, paid the filing fee to reactivate the limited liability company, and reviewed the original consulting agreements from 2017. The language was crystal clear. Valerix had been granted a non-exclusive license to use the patents during my consulting term, with no automatic renewal and no transfer of ownership. I had never signed the permanent employee intellectual property assignment because their human resources department had been too disorganized to follow up. They had built their entire multi-million-dollar software suite on top of my proprietary modules, and the lease had just expired. By the middle of the week, my legal counteroffensive was fully operational. I did not want a noisy confrontation or a messy public scene. I preferred the quiet certainty of federal intellectual property laws and structured contracts. I contacted Alan Reynolds, the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Monolith Systems, which happened to be Valerix's largest and most aggressive competitor in the database solutions market. Monolith Systems had spent years trying to crack the high-throughput logistics sector, but they had always been blocked by the superior speed of Valerix's platform. They did not realize that the speed they were fighting was not the result of Valerix's C-suite brilliance, but the result of the 17 patents I held. I sent Alan Reynolds a short professional email from my personal account. The subject line was clean and direct: licensing opportunity, proprietary network synchronization patents. His response arrived in exactly 25 minutes. He did not delegate it to an executive assistant or ask for a slide deck. He called my personal mobile phone. "George, I have been reading your engineering white papers for 3 years," Alan said, his voice carrying the deep weight of an old-school executive who knew the industry inside and out. "Is this the specific stack currently running the core Valerix engine?" "It is," I replied, "and the licensing rights are fully retained by my holding company, Advanced Tech IP Holdings. I am open to discussing a non-exclusive transfer of rights." We set a meeting for the following morning at a quiet conference room downtown, far from the trendy coffee houses where tech executives liked to gather. The room we rented was in an old library building downtown. The air inside smelled of aged paper, leather, and polish, a stark contrast to the glass and steel offices of Valerix, where style always took precedence over substance. Outside, a gentle autumn rain tapped against the tall arched windows, casting soft reflections across the long oak table where we spread out the legal folders. I had printed the full patent descriptions, starting from patent number 1, which covered the basic queue allocation trees, all the way to patent number 17, which dealt with high-speed memory recovery. Alan looked through the documents with the intensity of a general examining an enemy map. His legal team sat next to him, their fingers flying over laptops as they cross-referenced each registration with the records of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. While we were completing our analysis, the first cracks were already beginning to spread through the foundation of Valerix. I still had several close friends in the engineering department, people who had worked alongside me in the trenches before the marketing team took over the culture. One of them, Bradley Stone, sent me a message through a secure, encrypted messaging application. He attached a screenshot of an internal Slack thread from the compliance channel. The message was from Diana Ross, the lead compliance officer, and it read like a silent warning bell. "Can anyone locate the signed intellectual property transfer documents for the Vance kernel modules from 2017? Our external auditors are asking for the chain of title for our upcoming funding round, and I cannot find the signature page." The thread below her question was completely empty. No comments from the engineering managers, no replies from the legal team, and no thumbs-up emojis. Just a digital void. They were beginning to realize that the core engine of their entire product was legally unowned. A day later, Bradley sent me another screenshot. The sales department was in a complete panic. Their largest enterprise customer, a logistics giant that accounted for nearly 30% of Valerix's annual recurring revenue, had just sent back their contract renewal with a major revision. They were demanding proof of absolute patent compliance for all database modules before they would sign. In the enterprise software business, you can ignore a disgruntled developer, but you cannot ignore a compliance audit from your biggest client. The dominoes were starting to wobble. I could picture Logan Pierce pacing in his glass office, yelling at junior engineers to check the version control logs and find a way to rewrite the code. But database architecture is not a set of building blocks you can swap out over a weekend. The Vance kernel was embedded deep within their database layer, managing every single transaction and synchronization routine. To rewrite it would require a complete rebuild of the platform, a process that would take at least 2 years and tens of millions of dollars. Meanwhile, I sat in the quiet conference room with Alan Reynolds and his legal team. They spent 4 hours reviewing my patent files, checking every line of the registrations with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Everything was clean. Vance Tech IP Holdings owned the patents, and Valerix had no active agreement. Alan looked up from the folder, a sharp smile appearing on his face. "This is a clean sweep, George," he said. "If we license these patents, we can deploy the synchronization updates to our clients immediately, legally locking Valerix out of the enterprise market." I nodded slowly. "That is the idea," I said. "But there is one condition. We write it into the contract that Valerix is strictly excluded from any sublicensing or partner agreements. They do not get a back door out of this." Alan did not hesitate. "Done," he said, and we shook hands. The storm broke on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the time when C-suite executives are usually pretending to relax while secretly checking their email. The trigger was a public post by Sean Cooper, a respected software industry analyst with a reputation for dissecting enterprise technology contracts. Sean was followed by every major venture capitalist and chief information officer in the sector. His post was simple but devastating. He wrote, "Just noticed that 3 major enterprise security vendors have updated their licensing footers this weekend. They all now reference Vance Tech IP Holdings. Does anyone know who George Vance is and why he suddenly owns the network stack of the competition?" He attached a high-resolution screenshot of a software dashboard. There, in the bottom corner of the system log, was the new text in all capital letters, License D under Vance Tech. Holdings else. All prites. Within 2 hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times. The engineering community immediately began doing what it does best, reverse engineering the corporate drama. Someone found the Delaware Business Registry filings linking Vance Tech IP Holdings to my patents. Another analyst posted a timeline of my departure from Valerix, matching it with the date the competitors updated their software licenses. By Sunday evening, my name was trending in the technology section of the major forums. People were posting memes of an older engineer quietly walking out of a building while the structure behind him slowly crumbled. It was not a scandal, it was a public demonstration of leverage. The venture capital community began asking the only question that mattered to them. Did Valerix actually own the product they were pitching to investors? The comments on Hacker News and tech subreddits were relentless, with software engineers explaining in detail how the Vance kernel worked and why it was impossible to replace without breaking the system. On Hacker News, a thread titled "Why the Vance Kernel Matters" became the top post of the day. Developers were discussing the details of Patent 16, explaining how it prevented memory leaks during sudden traffic spikes. One comment read, "If you remove these modules, their system will collapse under any load higher than 10 requests per second." Another wrote, "The C-suite is about to find out that you cannot replace a senior engineer with a junior growth hacker and an AI writing assistant." I sat in my armchair, watching the notifications multiply on my phone screen. On the technology forums, thousands of developers were arguing about the implications of the patent transfers. Many of them were examining the code logs and pointing out that my personal signature was literally baked into the low-level database libraries. They joked that the C-suite at Valerix had spent millions on marketing, while the quiet guy next to the copier machine actually owned the engine. For years, I had been an invisible worker, But now the industry was realizing that the invisible worker had built the entire foundation. Our replacement product manager, Chloe Bennett, who was still trying to build her personal brand on LinkedIn by posting about empathy and leadership, sent out a message trying to calm everyone down. She suggested that the engineering team could simply find an open-source alternative and swap it in before anyone noticed the difference. But the senior engineers knew better. One of them replied directly in the Slack channel, pointing out that my patents covered the core routing logic, and any attempt to replace it would trigger a cascade of compile errors across the entire codebase. The developers were laughing in private while the managers were drafting emergency statements that said nothing and meant even less. Logan Pierce, true to form, could not help himself. He was terrified of losing his reputation as a visionary leader. He quote-posted Sean Cooper's analysis with a condescending remark. "You cannot own the future if you are stuck living in the past," Logan wrote, adding a smiley emoji. It was a desperate attempt to frame the patent dispute as a minor disagreement over obsolete technology. He wanted his investors to think the dispute was irrelevant, but his public post only drew more attention to the issue. I watched the replies roll in from my quiet living room. I logged into my account, which had been dormant for months, and typed a single word in response. "Licensed," I wrote. That one word was shared 5,000 times in less than an hour. It was a digital shrug that carried the weight of federal law. Technology journalists began calling my phone, and several prominent venture capitalists sent private messages asking if I was open to discussing an acquisition of the patent portfolio. I ignored them all. I did not need to explain myself to the media, and I certainly did not need to negotiate with middlemen. The math was already working in my favor. Inside Valerix, the panic had reached the executive suite. Bradley Stone sent me a screenshot of an emergency Slack announcement from the executive team. All engineering staff were ordered to report to the office at 8 o'clock on Monday morning for an emergency code review. They were looking for any way to strip the Vance kernel modules out of the upcoming software release. But I knew the code. I had spent 6 years making sure those modules were so deeply integrated into the system logic that removing them would cause the entire database to corrupt. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, and the key was locked inside a Delaware holding company they had dismissed as dead weight. The emergency board meeting at Valerix was convened at 6:30. On Tuesday morning, the hour reserved for corporate disasters. Thanks to Bradley Stone, I received the meeting details and a transcript of the opening remarks. The board had brought in outside counsel from a top-tier intellectual property firm. The lead attorney did not offer any comfort. He explained that under United States patent law, specifically 35 U.S.C., Section 271, Valerix was facing massive exposure. The consulting license had expired, and because no employee assignment had ever been signed, the continued distribution of the database engine constituted willful patent infringement. The financial damage was immediate and severe. The chief financial officer, who had spent the last 2 years bragging about low engineering costs, looked like he had seen a ghost. He kept clicking through the spreadsheet of their client list, pointing out that their biggest logistics client, the one that paid for their entire operations, was already talking to Monolith Systems. They were not just pausing renewals. They were preparing to sue Valerix for intellectual property exposure. The board members were furious, shouting over each other, demanding to know how a 54-year-old engineer without any stock options could have so much control over their multi-million-dollar software platform. The lead attorney from the intellectual property firm just shook his head and said, "You called him dead weight, but he is the one who owns the scale." The estimated financial impact was $94 million, and their upcoming funding round was dead in the water. No venture capital firm would touch a company whose core technology was subject to an active infringement claim. The temporary administrator, a seasoned restructuring specialist who had seen dozens of startups implode, did not even try to argue with the board. He immediately recommended that they settle the dispute, but I had already signed the exclusive agreement with Monolith Systems. There was nothing left to negotiate. The engineering team, realizing that the company was a sinking ship, began updating their own resumes. Two of the senior developers called me that night, asking if there were any open roles at Monolith Systems. I told them to send me their files, and I would pass them along to Alan Reynolds. The brain drain had begun, and Valerix was powerless to stop it. Then came the inevitable finger-pointing. The board members turned on Logan Pierce. He tried to defend himself, arguing that they could simply write a patch to bypass the patents, but the outside counsel shut him down. Rebuilding the database synchronization layer from scratch will take 18 months and cost millions, the lawyer said. And during that time, you cannot legally distribute the current version of your product. You are selling unlicensed technology. By the end of the day, Logan Pierce was gone. The official press release claimed he had resigned to pursue new opportunities in the technology sector, but everyone knew he had been thrown under the bus to save the board. It was a quiet exit for a man who had bragged about his $1,200 sneakers and his vision for the company. He was replaced by a temporary administrator whose only job was to minimize the legal damage. The next morning, I met Alan Reynolds at a quiet hotel behind the museum to sign the final licensing agreement with Monolith Systems. The room was soundproof, with no corporate logos or elevator music, just linen napkins, hot coffee, and the quiet dignity of a contract table. Alan was alone, carrying only a black moleskin notebook and a single folder. He did not bring a team of assistants. He was the kind of leader who understood that in our industry, true power belongs to the people who understand the technology, not those who merely present it on stages. We signed the agreement in less than 10 minutes, sealing a deal that gave Monolith Systems a massive competitive advantage. The terms were exactly as we had discussed: a significant upfront payment, ongoing royalties based on active deployments, a seat on their technical advisory board, and a strict exclusion clause. Monolith Systems now had the exclusive right to deploy the Vance kernel modules among the top-tier enterprise clients, effectively taking over the market share that Valerix had spent years trying to secure. As I signed my name at the bottom of the contract, I felt a deep sense of closure. This was not about anger or revenge. It was about logic. In engineering, if you build a system with a single point of failure, you should not be surprised when the whole thing collapses when that point is removed. Valerix had treated their engineers as replaceable parts, forgetting that the real value of a software company is not in the pitch decks or the marketing campaigns, but in the minds of the people who write the code. Today, if you look at the bottom of the system logs for the largest logistics platforms in the country, you will see a quiet line of text. It does not make any noise, and it does not post updates on social media. It just sits there, a legal footprint confirming that Vance Tech IP Holdings owns the foundation. Valerix is still trying to rebuild their platform, their engineering team working 80-hour weeks to replace the code they took for granted. But you cannot rush the physics of software. The company that once called me dead weight is now just a ghost in the market, while the quiet architect of their downfall is already building the next stack.